Welcome to Tab Podcasts. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about the Fae and the Elves. How are they different? Might they be similar in any way? Let's jump right in. It's time to take a break, take a seat, and take a listen. Okay, quick disclaimer before we get started. I'm by no means a professional on this topic. I'm not even sure how you would become a professional. I'm just someone who's a bit interested in this kind of mythology who did like 30 minutes of research before recording this. Anyway, for today we'll be comparing them in classic mythology. I may do a comparison between Fae and Elves in modern media because that's quite different from how they're different in like classic mythology, and I might do that in like another episode. So stay tuned if you're interested. Anyway, so a more traditional definition of the Fae would be a type of mythical creature with a humanoid form thought to live deep in forests or sometimes also in a separate magical realm. They are stronger, faster, and more beautiful than the average human, also having a better sense of smell and hearing. Some common descriptors for them would be cunning, manipulative, dangerous, and glamorous. In like the more in stories, more common stories, they are often shown to have a penchant for twisting their words, which is a way for them to get around their single weakness of being unable to tell lies. Their eloquence also helps them to strike hard bargains and write contracts skewed in their favor. So, of course, they do all of this because, like many other creatures in your classic mythology, they kind of want to hurt humans, or at least get humans out of their territory, that kind of thing. And so they'll twist their words and strike really hard bargains or things that things are basically slave contracts when they meet a human, so that they can mess with a human, kill them, whatever. Basically, they're not very kindly creatures. Yeah. So a favorite trick of the Fae is to play a word game by asking humans for their name. So they'll say, "Hi, may I have your name?" And while on like the surface it sounds like just a normal greeting, under it actually means what they're actually doing is they're literally asking for your name, like ownership of it. And because of their own magical Fae rules, knowing the name of a human, like the true name, the full name, will give the Fae power over the human, allowing them to essentially enslave the human. This also applies to the Fae though, as knowing a Fae's true name gives you great power over them and you can basically control them. Yeah. So that's the Fae in like a very short, quick description. Obviously there's a lot more to them, different sides, and more further like details and nuance, which I think are recorded in another podcast earlier. What are the Fae, that you can check out if you want to know more, but that's what you'll need to know for this comparison. Now, okay, now before we go to elves, see, Fae are kind of like the same in a lot of mythology, like they have their differences in each mythology, but the elves vary a lot more than the Fae in mythology. For example, a Fae in a Fae in Celtic mythology will have roughly look the same as like a Fae from Scottish mythology. They'll both be humanoid, very beautiful humanoid creatures. And yeah, but in folklore for our elves, they're often like really, really different. For example, in Germanic folklore, the elves are depicted similarly to the Fae. They're like um, very tall, humanoid, gorgeous figures, and are very clever and that kind of thing. However, for Celtic like mythology, or the Celtic definition of elves would actually be like tiny versions of humans. So they're still humanoid, but in Celtic mythology they would be these tiny 2-inch little people. Of course, they still have the pointed ears and stuff. Yeah, it's sort of, yeah, so there's like really big differences. And because for my description of the Fae I used a description of them that leans more towards Celtic mythology, I'm going to do the same with the elves, so they'll be easier to compare them. Yeah, so like I said, the elves in mythology, at least the type I'm referencing, are kind of like 2-inch tall mini humans. They're not very tall creatures, they're not very glorious, so to say. And there's this really common story, I think most people have heard of it. So it's about this old cobbler who makes shoes every day and he works really hard and blah 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 blah. And just one day, I think he's rushing to fulfill this really big order that came in from a very important client, and he's working super hard and he's making these beautiful, beautiful shoes. But yeah, and it's all so perfect, and he's working so hard, but he just can't finish them in time for the deadline. And he's panicking and he goes to sleep, and his wife is just telling him, calm down, don't think about it. We'll wake up early tomorrow and finish it. And when they wake up the next morning, mysteriously, the shoes are perfectly finished. And even more beautiful than the cobbler usually makes them, and he's shocked. And of course, the client is extremely pleased, and he doesn't have time to explain. The client picks up his shoes and whips away. And this repeats a few more times, as fairy tales often do. And so various different shoe orders that he has that he can't fulfill in time. He goes to sleep, and when he wakes up, the shoes are perfectly made. So he tries this one last time. So right, so he's trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, obviously it's great that this is happening, but what? So he does what he normally does. He takes his order. He makes a shoe halfway, and he puts it out on his countertop as he normally does, unfinished. And this time he's not rushing for a deadline. He's just doing this to try and find out what is going on. And instead of going to sleep, he stays up all night, hiding in some corner of his living room, watching the shoes. And then he sees these tiny 2-inch people, elves, with their pointed little ears, who come up and finish the shoes and make it absolutely beautiful. And one interesting contrast is that while the elves who make the shoes, like shoes that are made by the elves, are really beautiful and delicate and fine and perfect, the clothes actually worn by these elves are actually really torn and tattered. They're full of holes, they're all patched up, doesn't really fit them. I mean, they are tiny people, must be hard to find clothes that are for 2-inch tall people. Yeah, but you get the idea. So we can kind of see from here that maybe they're great at making shoes, but not normal clothes. Like, even the shoes they are wearing themselves are very nice, but their clothes are just abysmal. And of course, this old cobbler sees the scene. He's shocked. He's like, what? Magic exists? Holy bleep. Anyway, so he's like shocked. He tells his wife. His wife is like, oh, what nice little creatures. And after a while, they don't actually talk to the elves. I think they try, but the elves kind of run off. So as like a thank you gift, the cobbler does this again. He leaves his shoe out on the countertop, and the wife makes a bunch of tiny little clothes for the elves that are not tattered, torn, and falling apart, and puts them next to their shoes as a gift. And then the elves take the clothes, switch into their new shiny clothes that actually aren't falling apart, tattered, torn, disheveled, and they all look, and everyone's happy. That's just the story. Now that I think about it, doesn't really make sense. But from here, you kind of get the idea of the elves, whereas the fae are more neutral, evil and neutral, that kind of thing. And the elves are more neutral good. They lean more towards good than they do evil. But they're both, of course, they're still not humans. They're mythical creatures, so they can still be mischievous and play pranks, which is another type of story that I hear a lot about elves, where they're almost depicted kind of like pixies, but they're still like human form, but not with the wings. So where they have that same cheekiness to them, where they like to play pranks, like pulling your hair, pinching you. Yeah. So, but that type of story is less common. The cobbler one that I just told is like the most common. I think that type of story usually has context of them being pissed off. Yeah. So they're kind of dangerous, I guess. If there's like a bunch of them pinching and pulling your hair, it could hurt a lot. But overall, probably not the most dangerous thing in the world. Alright, so that's. Oh my god, my bones just cracked. Sorry. Anyway, so that's our two creatures. Now that we've introduced them, let's compare and contrast. So for similarities, they're both humanoid mythical creatures. Like, they both have human features, they both resemble humans. One is just, yeah. And another similarity we can kind of say is they're both somewhat neutral creatures. Like, obviously, one leans more towards malicious and more can we really say evil? Because in like traditional mythology, Fae are trying to drive. Well, sometimes Fae are portrayed as like protectors of where they stay, and they're trying to drive the humans out. But sometimes they're also portrayed as going into where the humans live to actively enslave and just hurt humans. So, but overall, they're quite neutral creatures who kind of stick to themselves, and then occasionally they go out to have to help for the elves help, and the Fae have fun. Yeah, and that's it for similarities. They're actually not as similar as you might think. I think similarities would increase a lot if we're taking a look at Fae versus elves in a modern context and in modern media, because they're more similar then. But yeah, let's take a look for differences now. Let's just switch to look actual contrast, which I'm sure what many people are actually here for. Anyway, so let's start with size. So the Fae are normal human size. They're anywhere from 1.6 to 1.2, you know, just normal human, but like more beautiful, more dangerous. Meanwhile, elves are like humans that got shrinked. They're probably not bigger than your cup. Maybe bigger than your average teacup, but not bigger than a mug. Very chill creatures. Well, not really, but no, I don't know why I was saying that. But anyway, yeah. So that's the first big like visual difference, and the other visual difference would be the Fae are more beautiful, because one distinct important trait of the Fae is that they are extremely beautiful, almost unnaturally beautiful, glamorous, stunning. Meanwhile, the elves, like I said, are just kind of normal humans shrunk down. Like, they're pretty and they have their little elf pointy ears and stuff, but they're not extraordinary. Yeah. And then after that, we have the next difference, which would be the Fae are more dangerous than the elves. Like I said, they have magic. Essentially, when they play their word games, when they strike bargains and contracts, this magic kind of kicks in to make all of these contracts and bargains like hold weight. Like if you don't hold up your end of the bargain, there'll be actual consequences. And of course, in some stories, the Fae are portrayed to have even more magic than this. Although their magic tends to be more subtle. It's not like the type you point and something explodes. It's more like you have a conversation with them, and at the end of it, they're walking away and laughing, and all of a sudden you find you're slowly turning into a pig. They didn't say anything, they didn't really do anything overt, it's just happening. Yeah, I guess it's also because sometimes they're considered to be like part of magic, so it just happens. Meanwhile, yeah, like I said, elves, their ways of hurting people are more limited to more human things. Pinching, pulling, especially with their smaller size, there's very little that they can actually do. Yeah. And of course, the Fae are just generally stronger. Like, not looking at magic aside, but physicality, the Fae are faster than normal humans. Meanwhile, elves are slower than normal humans. It's kind of like comparing an ant to a human running. Obviously, the human's faster because the legs are shorter, that kind of thing. And lastly, the Fae are more cunning. They're just smarter. They have a penchant for twisting words. Meanwhile, elves might be a little bit more honest. Yeah. So that's about it for today. I think I've covered what I wanted to cover. Obviously, there's a lot more to Fae and Elves, but this is a very quick description of them. Honestly, it's more like a comparison between Fae and humans, because elves are actually not that different from humans, other than being very, very slightly magical, with their pointy ears being kind of long lived and being tiny. Like, obviously, they've got some mad skills with their shoemaking and whatever. Well, that's not really magical, is it? It's more like they were born with that talent. You know what I mean? Yeah. Meanwhile, the Fae are just magical, more mythical in a way than, say, the elves. At least that's how I see it. So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed. This was a very short little podcast, just investigating some more simple things, Fae versus elves. I'd love to do another one of these, but with modern literature, because it gets a bit more interesting there, because similarities, there are a lot more similarities, and we can talk about why they became more similar over the years. Yeah, so if you enjoyed this, please feel free to check out the other episodes. What are the Fae? I talk about a lot more about the fan stories I've heard over the years. If you feel like this description of them has been too brief, you can go there to hear more, or you can just comment and tell me about some stories you've heard over years. You can find me on both Spotify and YouTube, and I'll see you next week. Bye.